Welcome to Down to Earth. My name's Melissa, and this is my friend Caleb, and we're joined today by Uncle Marty. We're really excited to have you guys joining us to hear some incredible stories about how God is working in amazing ways across the world.
Melissa and myself and some of our friends have been studying the Bible, and we've been really impressed with these amazing stories. They're almost superhuman in nature. And a couple things come to mind. Either A, they're all true and God is real, or B, they're all fake and we just need to forget about it. But I choose to believe that they are real, and we're really excited because Uncle Marty has some modern day stories for us.
But maybe just for our friends' sake who are joining us, would you share a little bit about your background and your story and where your journey with God is as you've gone on the same journey that Caleb and I and some of our friends are going on right now?
Yes, I was just thinking back about 26 years ago. Back when I was in college, I started having some very serious questions, some of the same questions you're having, Caleb, and your friend group. Is God real? How are we going to accomplish the Great Commission? The Bible says go to every people group, every nation. And I was studying theology and I was saying, how? How is this ever going to happen? And that was the big question on my mind. If God's real, how is this going to happen? I just see churches, nothing against it, but I didn't see how we were doing church today would really fulfill the Great Commission.
Almost some like monotony where people got into a culture and weren't actually living their faith anymore. It was just kind of how life was happening.
Exactly. And I was questioning how are we going to see this spontaneous growth? We have worked in the Christian world, but we have these big blocks in the world of Muslims that today is 1.6 billion. We have Hindus, over 1 billion people. We have over 850 million Buddhists. Then we have in our own culture, a great portion of what was considered traditionally the Christian world is really a post-Christian world today. Mm-hmm. People won't go to a brick and mortar church. Even people in my own family don't want to step any longer inside a brick and mortar church. So my question was, what you're asking us to do is take the gospel commission to all the world. How are we going to reach that? And so these were some of the questions that were really at the bottom of my soul as I was asking God at about the same age time, maybe a little bit younger when I was in college.
So my guess is that you came up with a little bit of an answer. How did you get there?
Well, to where I am now, to what happened then, God took me on an incredible journey. While I was studying, I had this real struggle. Mm-hmm. How am I going to be a minister of God? I felt a calling to ministry, but I did not feel a calling to be a typical pastor. Mm-hmm. And I had this big struggle because I had no idea how this would pan out, how it would work. But I knew I was called to ministry, so I said, why don't I go work as a student missionary? So I went and found myself in the middle of the Amazon jungle first.
Wow.
And God started teaching me lessons along the way. And I worked for ADRA actually in the Amazon jungle. Then ADRA invited me to go work in Russia. I went back to school to continue my studies, and then I was invited to go work in Azerbaijan and different places. But after working in Russia, I had a real life transforming experience. I had a couple $1,000. I traveled for just a little under 4 months, so it was about $2.50 a day or so that I traveled all over Asia, Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I don't know how I did it. Things were cheaper back then, but I put on a backpack.
How many countries did you hit on this 4 month trip?
Maybe 15 or 16 countries.
Wow.
A lot of this was on the cheapest bus, the cheapest trains, mm-hmm. and so forth as I did this trip. And I did a lot of exciting things, humanly speaking. I mean, I went to the base of Mount Everest, went rafting clear up from the mountains all the way to the jungle in Nepal, and had incredible experiences, went to the pyramids, met incredible people. But while I was on that journey, God had a lot more planned for me to learn in that journey, in that process, to start answering those questions in a way that I never imagined possible.
So it sounds like he kind of took you on this trip of, let's go see the world and enjoy life a little bit before I get tied down to a profession or something like that. But God had a bigger picture, a bigger plan in mind.
He did. And I had several unique things happen. When I went to visit the pyramids in Egypt, and I was with some friends, because we went with a small friend group on this, what we called almost an epic trip, and then many people joined, and it was kind of a fluid group as we traveled around, and part of it I did as alone. But we were in Egypt, saw the pyramids, exciting, rode camels out in the desert. But I went to the Adventist church there. And after church, I asked the pastor, this is a Muslim country, small minority Christians. I asked him, how are we going to reach the Muslim population? That was my big question as I was traveling through this area. And he says, it's not my responsibility. I don't want to know about it. It's too hard for us.
So he basically kind of washed his hands of it. He's like, I'm not even going to do
That's
it.
how I interpreted it.
Yeah.
Later, I ended up living there, working for the church in the area, actually working for the union that oversaw these areas, and then I came to understand him. He was a minority person. For him to work for the majority people was actually very dangerous. It would put his church in jeopardy. And so after I got to know him, and then 10 years later, sitting in his home meeting, he explained to me 10 years later, you should understand more to the question that you asked me. Just to have permission to paint our church takes 5 years. And if many people that aren't from our people group come into the church, we can't even have permission to repaint our church. So it left me that we have to find unique ways to reach to the people. Now, I didn't know a lot about Muslims in that time, and during that trip, just a few weeks later, I found myself in another Muslim country, in Pakistan. And I was traveling, seeing the sights of Pakistan. I was actually quite tired. I was going to the hotel, and the taxi driver starts talking to me. This Muslim, very poor Muslim taxi driver. He didn't even own the taxi. He actually rented the taxi, and he just kept a commission of his daily payment. But he started talking to me, and I wasn't very interested. I wanted to see the sights and sounds and wasn't really interested in talking with this taxi driver. And he starts telling me stories. He says, young man, I want to share with you about God. And he shares these 2-3 stories with me that are really, really challenged me. He says, what, God is so amazing that he's like a mother. If a house burns down, that mother will do anything. Even if the father's scared, a mother will push past the firemen. She will come in and run into a burning building to save her child, even if a father doesn't. And this is what God's all about. He wants to save us. He told me stories of a mother chicken. A mother chicken will stay with her babies even if a barn burns down, and to save her chicks. And he told me numerous stories like this. And I was listening to them. They weren't really hitting me. But when we got to our destination, there'd just been a quiet time. And I start to leave, get my bags out of the back of the trunk, and then he calls me back. Young man, come back to the taxi. I thought maybe he was going to ask for an extra tip or something like this, like they do many times there. And then he looks me straight in the eyes. And he says, young man, I want to challenge you. And I say, what's the challenge, sir? I want you to follow God with all your heart, whether you're a Christian or Muslim. But the important thing is to follow God with all your heart.
Wow.
And this taxi driver you said was a Muslim, right?
He was.
And he was challenging you to make sure you followed God with all your heart.
Now I felt, as he finished, as I walked away, I felt this big knife in my heart. I said, wow, I was not wanting to talk with him. Here am I, a theology student, preparing for the ministry. It didn't even occur to me to share my faith with him. And here is this poor taxi driver who just comes and really challenges me in a very, very powerful way. And so this left me really thinking. It left me thinking that God actually was working inside Muslims. Who is this taxi driver to challenge me to worship the one true Creator God? These were 2 pivotal points in my trip. And then I had 2 more. And on the trip, I ended up in India as well. Traveled for several weeks through India. And on Sabbath, we went to one of the churches there, and I didn't know, just by chance, it was like the Union Church. It's where the Union went. And after church, the church organizer there invited us to his home to have lunch. And so after lunch, we talked, and I was very interested to know about how the church in India worked and functioned. And as we were talking, he really opened up his heart. And he said, our church here is really dead. We can't advance. We can't do anything. Yeah, I mean, today it's different, the situation, but at that time the church was just kind of stuck. And I asked him, Pastor, why is the church stuck? And he says, well, it really boils down, there's numerous reasons, but the main reason is because Indian women wear a wedding band style piece necklace, and this represents that they're married. You see, my wife's not married yet. But if we go out together, people are always talking, who is this old couple together that aren't married?
Because she doesn't wear the same necklace.
That she doesn't wear the same necklace. And she says no families really want to become baptized believers because we're asking them to take off this symbol of our marriage. Mm-hmm. And it looks very bad in our country for people not to be married to be together. Mm-hmm. And why even in the market we hear whispers, and we're 60 years old. And I says, well, have your wife put it back on. And she says, well, for me it would be fine, but you know what happened? And he was real quiet. And I says, well, what happened? And he didn't want to tell me. And I says, well, tell me, Pastor, please. So he kind of lowers his voice and he says, well, if I did that, I would be fired. The foreign American missionaries that work at the division would fire me tomorrow. They don't understand our culture. They are interpreting it from 18th century America and not interpreting it to our local context. And that just really gripped me. Why are we so blind, not able to see? Why are we holding up God's work over these forms? And so we traveled. I later ended up traveling for many weeks more, found myself in China, had traveled several weeks. I think I traveled all the
I think this sounds like the trip of a lifetime.
Yeah. I did. I traveled for 3 weeks for $120. I came to the last little piece there, and I think I had $10 left in my pocket or something to get back home, just enough to get up to the airplane. And I got caught, didn't have money to go to a hotel, and I was like between Hong Kong and China. Hong Kong was still a British possession at that time. And it was cold, it was drizzling, and I just waited all night there. But in that very cold night where I was all sopping wet, and there was a whole group of kind of these travelers that travel, you'll kind of hang together, I felt God really talking to me. And as I thought through these events, and having traveled through these vast areas of where the gospel really still needed to be taken to Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu countries, I just felt God saying, Marty, I want you to work for the unreached people. And so that night, while I was shivering in the cold, I took this, said, okay, God, I've been running away. I've wanted to be in ministry. I haven't wanted to be a typical pastor, but I will commit myself to work for the unreached. So that was a bit of the beginning of my story. And then God continued to lead me on more journeys. I went back to school after this and studied for a few more months. And then the phone rang. And it was from ADRA International. And I'd already worked for ADRA and the Amazon jungle, worked for them in Russia, and asked, would you like to go to Azerbaijan? And so I said, let me think about it. I called back the next day, and within a week, I was on the plane to go work in Azerbaijan.
Was this before you were married or after you?
This was before I was married. Okay. So jumped on the plane, found myself in Azerbaijan, and enjoyed the time immensely working there, but the weather was extreme. Winter, it was 40 below with almost no electricity, no heating. I was absolutely miserable. In the summer, it was up over 120. Now that was an extreme year, but it was just very miserable, the living conditions. But I did enjoy the time there. We had a massive food distribution. The country was at war, but I said I'd never go back there. So I went back to school, basically finished up school, got married, and again the phone rang. I had said I'd never go back to Azerbaijan under any circumstances. I hated the extremes and just having lived in such difficulty. But the phone rang again, and it says, are you willing to go back to Azerbaijan? ADRA International. And I said, I had said I'd never go. They said, please think about it. About 10 days later, I said, okay, God, I will go. If seems like you've orchestrated this, I know the people, I can go back.
Never say never.
Never say never. That's the important thing. So while I was there, God continued to lead me on a journey. And I worked with funds paid by the U.S. government, so I wasn't supposed to be involved in the area where I worked with any real mission activity. But in another city, there had been a church that had basically been decimated due to ethnic cleansing. And so the people had to flee because they had been at war with a Christian state of Armenia. All Christians now needed to leave the country. And an Adventist church of about 100, over 100, about 120 members was decimated to about 20-some believers there. And they had just received a new young pastor. And I challenged him, why don't you see what God can do? Because you don't have any of the Germans. The church had been made up of Slavic or white Russians, of Germans, and even of Jews. And a lot of these people have immigrated. Now you need to reach the local indigenous Azeris. And I believe this is what God is telling us to do. And that young pastor took up this vision, and we would meet with him every 2, 3, 4 weeks, talk over about a 3-year period, and we just saw amazing things happen. And so as we talked, how are we going to reach the local Azeris? God just started opening up what had seemed like a total blockade, impossible to do in time of war. We just saw God come in, but it took some very distinct steps. So one of the first steps that was taken was that they decided to speak, instead of in Russian, in the local language. They then stopped singing in the Russian, old Russian hymn book, and God gave them, one of the members got this gift of music and started creating this most beautiful Azeri religious music.
Wow.
And it really started touching. But then they took some steps that was even bigger than this. They realized that there was great resistance to the word Christian. And so they just took this out of their vocabulary and said, we are followers of Jesus. And we saw resistance come down. By now we have about 50 members in the church. And then they realized that they needed to stop using the very word church, because Azeris, there was a lot of prejudice towards church, and they took down what they had got during Soviet times at great difficulty, permission to use the word church. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they took this down and said a prayer house for all people. It jumps to about 75 to 80 believers. Then one of the old members of the church, an old Iranian lady, because this city's right on the border with Iran, and she had been from Iran. She says, guys, there's another step we need to take. And the church comes around the elders, what is it? She had called the meeting of the elders, and she was a part of the elders group. She says, you know, I was a very strong practicing Muslim before I became an Adventist and a Christian. She says, but I became an Adventist due to what I had learned in the Quran. The Quran is full of these bridges to Jesus. It talks about Jesus 93 times. It talks about the Sabbath. Actually, she said, most Adventist beliefs can be found in the Quran. And I believe that our next stage now is we need to build upon these truths that are right here. And the elders talked back and forth. There was still one Jewish family, and he was one of the elders, one Azeri man, one Jewish man. And the Jewish man says, it makes sense to me. Just as our people should be able to worship as Jews, if we're a large Jewish congregation, so should the Muslims. And we need to really make this fellowship a fellowship that's indigenous and will speak to the hearts of the people. And this is what they did. And now it just starts growing.
So basically, the message stayed the same. All that changed was saying, what's our approach? What's the vocabulary? What's the form in which we're using? We're still keeping the message of God. We're still sharing Him with the world, but we're taking away those vocabularies or those actions that, because of cultural reasons or because of historical reasons, build up walls.
Exactly. So to make a long story short, they basically took away these barriers. And then I felt this deep calling, Marty, I want you to work full-time for unreached people groups. And I want you to stop your work. And I said, why, God? I have like 200 employees here. I'm loving what I'm doing. He says, but if you take what you have learned here and we can do this elsewhere, we're going to see mighty things for me happen. I went through a struggle. To make a long story short, I ended up working for the Global Center for Adventist Muslim Relations, and it's worked for the General Conference. And then my boss sent me. He became sick, and I went to do many of the trips he was involved for. So I went to one of his trips overseas to Asia, and I can't share the name of this country. And I ended up in this country with this big camp meeting of believers. Now this was very different from Azeris. In this country, Azeris dress like we do. But these people dressed in Muslim dress, traditionally of their country. They had long beards. Many of these people were elderly gentlemen, along with many families.
It was like a culture shock for you.
So this is now big culture shock. But now I'm in for a massive surprise, because these people actually perceive themselves to be Muslims. And I says, who are these people? But they, at the same time, were followers of Jesus. And all week, their sermons were powerful. I was touched by them as they were translated to me. They were fully biblical, but their identity were Muslim followers of Jesus. And I was totally shocked. And every night I was thinking, what in the world is this? But as I spoke to these people, I realized these people are followers of Jesus. But how can these two things match? Being a Muslim and being a follower of Jesus. Well, not all the answers were given to me then, but at nights I would then grill these people and say, tell me what you believe. And they've said, well, we've had visions and dreams of Jesus. We worship in our homes on Sabbath. And as I found out, many of these people there were actually Muslim leaders. And he's saying, one told me, I have 400 groups, followers of Jesus. Another one says, I have 200 believers in my mosque. And I'm getting more and more shocked about this. And I'm having a real question. What did my boss get me into? Who are these? How can I work? And I was just really in shock. But it came to Sabbath, and we had communion. And there at the communion, things started to change in my heart. And one old man who was in his mid-70s, he comes up and pats me and says, young man, can I wash your feet?
Wow.
And so he came, and in their culture, they're accustomed to sitting on the ground down to earth like we are doing right now in this show. And he could squat very well. So he just kind of squatted up and gave me one of his feet to wash. And then I washed that one. Then I washed the second one. And then it came for him to wash my feet, but he saw that I couldn't squat like they could. And so he went and found this little bench. He sits me down on the little bench, and then he lovingly washes one foot after another of mine. Then he takes me and they're much more touchy than we are and much more embracing. So he just pulls me up in this like bear hug, and he has this powerful prayer in the name of Jesus, that God will bless my life, that Christ will be the Lord of my life, and all kinds of stuff starts going through my head. Wow,
And this
Lord.
is a Muslim gentleman.
This is a Muslim gentleman who's a follower of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I start to saying, God, who am I to question what you are doing? Who am I? And all of a sudden, during that prayer, because he goes on, it's a long prayer, it hits me, this is what you've been looking for, Marty, all along. You were wondering how you were going to reach, how we were going to reach. I'm already working among them. I want you to open your eyes. For too long we have focused on what Satan has been doing and the works of Satan and not the works of God. And if anything we remember today, it's what I want us to remember. For too long we have been seeing Satan. We need to see where God is working, and that had become the mission in my life. Where is God working today? That man was so sold out to Jesus because another person who was visiting, he took photos. It went into the Adventist Ministry magazine. 3 months later, a crowd comes to this man and says, are you going to give up Jesus or not? He said, I will die for Christ. And they said, so well you have spoken. They took him to the center plaza, they picked up stones, and he was stoned to death for the name of Christ. The man who washed my feet, the one who I'd questioned, was he a true follower of Jesus or not? He was willing to die for him. And while he was praying for me, I said, Lord, I will give my life so that people like him can also be a follower of Jesus. And in God's right time, in the last moments of Earth's history, we will stand together. Whether we come from the Advent movement, from a Christian Western, or people from Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, I think we'll all stand in God's timing together as a unified people. And that has just become really the source of my inspiration, that God is working. And over this series, there's about 10 to 12 people that I work with very closely from different people groups. And people who come from the most unexpected of places, but people that God is using in the most powerful ways. And it's like you started saying, Caleb, this superheroes. There isn't superheroes, but we become super in Christ. And Christ can take the most unexpected of people, and we will hear their stories over the next few months or weeks as we get together each week to talk about this.
Yeah. Wow, that's really incredible. I really like the paradigm shift, I guess, for myself of thinking about, where God is working instead of where Satan's working. Because so long, growing up in the church culture that I grew up in, that was a lot, if anything went bad, it was, oh, the devil's working against us here. But nobody ever talked about when something was going good, oh, God's working here, or even going out and finding where God is working throughout the world with all these unreached people.
It's always like you have a disaster happens, or you hear about this tribe of people who are killing each other or something. And so then you're like, okay, we need to send missionaries out, or we need to send people out to help fix this problem and bring God to this problem, and not necessarily go and say, is God already there?
Well, see, this is what I've found so key, is to find, where is God working today? Where is God working in the past? Where will He work in the future? And as we make that change in us, I think there's changes that it totally changes our focus. We try to see God in the other and not the evil one in the other. And when we do that, it totally transforms the dialogue. The dialogue, we now are standing together, and as I've found people that we'll hear stories about, you can feel God's presence because you're looking for them, and there's this immediate bonding. We come from different peoples, different societies, even different religious backgrounds, but God is there with us.
Well, Uncle Marty, that was a very powerful personal testimony from you. And I just want to thank you for opening your heart and your past and sharing that story with Caleb and I. I know that's really touched us, and I hope it's touched our audience out there as well today.